Everybody in here can read, so on there is an introduction to Jerry Mansfield. Jerry and I have been friends 50 years. That's pretty unbelievable, but I was thinking back, that since high school, there was a few times there was a hiatus in college, but otherwise, it's pretty rare for us not to see each other couple of times a month and at least share a meal. And one of the things that I would say about Jerry is a good friend. And here's the way I judge friends. A good friend will send you a good pocket knife on special occasions. And Jerry does that. A lot of times he, whatever it was, some special occasion, birth of a child, gives me a pocket knife as well as the child a pocket knife. And then he would see a pocket knife and he would just go, I like that. And so he'd get him one and me one, and it wouldn't be a special occasion. But when you got a great, great friend is, he buys you a pocket knife, he sends it to you anonymous from some location, Texas or something, and you open it up and you go, I know Jerry did it. So the last one that he did like this one was this one. But now, he's never admitted to giving me this knife, even though I know he did, because first time I saw him, I go, Jerry, I know you did it. He goes, what? I said, you gave me that Baxter Black knife. He just grinned and said, I don't know what you're talking about, but I do know you gave it to me, Jerry, even though you hadn't confessed to it to this day. But I'm not going to take up Jerry's time. I could tell stories on Jerry, and he could tell them on me, and I hope he doesn't tell any on me. But if he leaves any time at the end, which I don't expect because y'all ask him a lot of questions too, but it does give me great pleasure to introduce my friend Jerry Mansfield.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Glad you limited your remarks. A special time in the county is coming pretty soon. I think this coming September, the 200th anniversary of the gathering and rendezvous at Camp Blount. We know it as Hardee's and Taco Bell, Walmart. I'll never forget Mr. Eugene Ham making the first speech I ever heard talk to a class about Camp Blount and Houston and Crockett and General Jackson coming down and Dr. McKinney. He was talking to these students, and you could see their eyes that already had glazed over. As entertaining as he is, you can't hold attention to everybody. And he said, I know y'all are imagining this set of troops getting them a Hardee's biscuit and heading off, and they did this, yeah. At least they knew where it was. So 200 years ago, great events here. 150 years ago, which is going on now, Fred I. Womack would have called it the War of Northern Aggression was taking place. The Civil War, and there's reenactments going on all over the South and on into Pennsylvania. They just finished the Gettysburg reenactment up, and some of our locals, Jim Hanna being one of them, went up and participated in that this time. It's been 50 years since JFK was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. All of us that are old enough, I was walking out of sophomore English class and you'll remember where you were when things like that happened, but it doesn't seem possible that it's been 50 years since President Kennedy lost his life in Dallas, which I'll bring up one more person that I didn't intend to, because if any of you know Tim and Helen Marsh. Tim Marsh is one of the greatest historians I've ever met, and he influenced me to find more true facts about history. Tim passed away yesterday in Shelbyville, Tennessee. I got the brief obituary from Kurt Cobb last night, But he made me aware of the little bitty pieces and the connecting the dots in history and the stories that go with it is what really makes it where you remember it. It's not all about dates and times and wars and that. It's about the personal stories. And so I've tried to emulate him, But I'm going to give you a brief while I'm talking up here. I'm going to run this down. Because you don't know anybody that's 92 years old, you don't know what they did in World War II. But Tim served in World War II, and he was a communications specialist and instructor in the intelligence branch of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, in Washington, Tennessee, in World War II. So Tim didn't start off with small potatoes. He did a lot of broadcasting work, and I want to give a little tribute to him today as far as he and Miss Helen have published 75 books on history. If you go to Lincoln County Courthouse, go to the county clerk's office, and you're looking for the cemetery book, that's Tim and Helen. They researched all the cemeteries. Of course, Bedford County, where they lived and where he currently was the historian, he and Helen were jointly. Bedford County, Lincoln County was part of Bedford County for 2 years. And so all the cemeteries, you've got somebody that served at a certain time, they may have a Bedford County record when they're really they were in Lincoln County 2 years later. So a little bit about Tim. Because we are talking, the word while ago that you mentioned in the prayer, service above self. If we're going to have a little theme today, which I'm not a theme person, but we'll make this about service above self. And I'm going to ask you to put one little image in your mind here that we're going to come back to near the end. A rusty, old Coca-Cola cooler, the metal kind. So if you've got that rusty Coca-Cola cooler in your mind, we'll come back to it later on. During World War II, the winter of 41 and 42, 1941 and 42, was especially trying on not just this country, but this community. The medical doctors that were practicing here, most of them had been called to war. That were Dr. Marshall, Dr. McCowan, Dr. T.A. Patrick was still providing service here. Dr. Yearwood had been ill for quite some time. But this particular time I'm going to tell you about a young man who had severe, we'd call it oral surgery. What they had done, they'd taken out two teeth and the bleeding wouldn't stop. Dr. Patrick, Dr. T.A. Patrick, old Dr. Patrick, most people want to refer to him, was known for two things, abrupt action and fast driving. And he was fast driving. He was coming in from a house call and had a wreck, and it put him into a neck brace. And so he's laying in the old Lincoln County Hospital in a neck brace. Dr. Yearwood's sick, and they bring this young man to the hospital and put him in the room next to Dr. T.A. Patrick. And he is in a very weakened condition. So from this laying down in a neck brace position, Dr. Patrick is instructing the nurses on what to do to keep him from dying. And they abate the bleeding quite a bit, and he decides it's best now for him to be sent home here in town. And so he stays at home for a full day before the bleeding started back. And so they contacted Dr. Patrick and said, what do we do? Well, Dr. Patrick, being how he worked, and I'll tell you how abrupt he is. Not only did they have that wreck coming back from that house call, he was also the county health officer, back when you had to have county health officers. And word got out that some people that, if I mention their name, you'll know them, or their kinfolks. So I won't mention their names. But they were out around Howell Hill. And they were making a pretty good living on the weekend. It was summertime. And they were charging a dime a person to come through the gate to go back to the old tenant house to view their brother who had contracted rabies, who was chained to the wall with a dog collar around his neck. And Dr. T.A. Patrick gets word that this is going on, and so he flies through the gate, and the young man's trying to collect the dime, and he tells him he's the county health officer, and zooms on down to the house, jumps out of the car, pulls his medical bag out, and then the father of the young man that's chained up inside the house with soap in his mouth and running and growling at everything. The father runs up and says, "What is it, Doc? What is it?" He said, "I'm a county health officer. I'm here to give him a killer cure shot." And he's drawing his syringe up. He said, "What a killer cure shot." And the young man inside the house went, "I'm all right, I'm all right." And so that's kind of how Dr. Patrick would take care of situations from time to time. So he broke that little ring of charging a dime up right quick. So Dr. Patrick is laying there prone in this hospital room, and they tell him the young man has gone back into a very bad state of bleeding. And he says, "Get a hold of Dr. L.M. Donaldson for me." Said, "Tell him I need to talk to him." Dr. Donaldson had his office behind where Bill's building is, nearly where the Green Frog was, second floor. He was practicing medicine here, had never practiced on a white patient, and was summoned to Dr. Patrick to tell him, he says, "You go to the house and you treat this young man. Here's what you need to do." Very reluctantly, Dr. Latham Mitchell Donaldson agreed. And he walked up to the house and told the mother-in-law that he was there to treat her son-in-law. He treated him 2 days, went back and reported to Dr. Donaldson that his situation was grave. Dr. Donaldson had him brought back to the hospital, and for the first time, a black doctor walked into Lincoln County Hospital to treat this young man. And under Dr. Patrick's tutelage, Dr. L.M. Donaldson did his very best, but it wasn't meant to be for him to survive. And you can imagine the feelings that Dr. Donaldson had when his first white patient he loses. And he's sitting in that office upstairs when there's a knock on the door, and standing at the door is the young man's father-in-law. And I don't think I could imagine what was going through Dr. Donaldson's mind of what was about to happen. But as Mr. Wiley from Malina, that's Billy Joe and Don's grandfather, Dot Schrader's grandfather, walked up to the desk and he said, "Dr. Donaldson, I'm here to tell you how much I appreciate you trying to save my son-in-law's life. And I just, I know money is not everything, but I wanted to come personally thank you for what you did and what you attempted to do." And that kind of broke the ice, and he said, "What do you like to do? What do you like to get into? What's your hobbies?" He said, "Well, I love to rabbit hunt and squirrel hunt." He said, "Well, let me tell you what. You come on out this season. Wiggy season opens up. You come to my farm and go hunting." So it so happened that he drove up, opening season for rabbits. Squirrel season probably had already been open. And as he drove up to Mr. Wiley's farm down at Malina, Mr. Wiley met him out in the backyard, and he looked in the back seat and he says, "What's in the Coca-Cola cooler?" He said, "Well, Miss Claudia made my lunch and said, I'm gonna put my squirrels and my rabbits in there." He said, "Well, you can put your squirrels and rabbits in there, but said, if you're coming to my farm to hunt, you're gonna have dinner, whichever meal we're having, dinner, supper, whatever we're having, you're gonna eat with us. We're gonna, just another way I can thank you for what you tried to do." So for nearly 40 years, Dr. L.M. Donaldson went to the Wiley farm and hunted and broke bread with them and became a fast family friend. Where the Coca-Cola cooler came in was just about 8 or 9 years ago, when Miss Claudia was cleaning out some of the remnants of what Dr. Donaldson had collected. And she carried a large load of it to one of the antique places right where other side of where Allison's menswear was, for those of you that know where Allison's menswear was, next to Bagley and Bagley. And she left it there. And when Miss Dot Schrader came by, this was after Doug had died, she knew Cindy collected everything Coca-Cola. And there was this old beat up Coca-Cola cooler. Cindy would want that. So she said, how much is it? And they said $125. She said, my goodness. She said, but it's got a story behind it. Miss Claudia Donaldson brought that in there. She said, I know all about it. So she went back and retrieved the money and bought the Coca-Cola cooler that Dr. Donaldson had bought for his first trip to go down to the Wiley Farm to hunt. The reason I wanted to share that story with you on this day is people like Dr. L.M. Donaldson, Latham Mitchell Donaldson, come along very, very rarely that are willing to put their life, their career, their reputation on the line at a time in 1941 and 42, the winter of, when it was not the most popular thing to do, of trying to attempt to save someone's life and to enter the hospital for the first time. He paved the way for what our community benefits from today. Not just from that particular event, but for years on forward. He served admirably in the quarterly court. We call it the county commission now. He built the first black hospital between Chicago and the Gulf Coast, and Donaldson Hospital, and he closed it and merged it with Lincoln County Hospital because he knew that was the time and thing to do. It was well done that the hospital board selected the name Donaldson Nursing Home after him, and then when that had some issues that had to rebuild out here, that they retained his name because of service above self that he provided for this community. So I've picked this story up one piece at a time. I shared it with leadership in Lincoln County in an abbreviated form because something like this, you can't make it up and you can't add to it. You got to get the facts as they go along. But Robert Lee Burns, who is buried in Rose Hill, who died on that day, whose daughter grew into Dot Schrader, I know he was appreciative of what was done to help him try to survive. And we definitely know Mr. Wiley was proud of what Dr. Donaldson did. So I'm going to leave you with that today unless you got any questions. That Dr. Donaldson, in my opinion, was one of the, I guess you could say, movers, shapers of this community. He always loved he loved coon hunting, and he'd have the huge coon hunt. Have any of you ever been to one of Dr. Donaldson's coon hunts? Is anybody in your, Judge Holman, I'm sure when you was running you wanted to go, but you was afraid you'd. You wish you'd call. If you got plenty to eat, and it wasn't the biggest raccoon you could find, it was the most. So you bring them back by the sackfuls, the way I understand it. But him and Miss Claudia, I wanted to remember both of them today, and I wanted to remember Tim Marsh on the front end today because of what he provided in remembering what this community is about too. But service above self, Dr. Latham Mitchell Donaldson. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions for Jake?
We want to know who that family was that had
It's the family that lived on a curve, who's the second generation, thought it would be a good money-making venture to line up 5 or 6 older cars in the curve, and it was a flat curve, and when it was rain, people would run off the curve and hit one of his cars, and the insurance company would pay for it. That got to be kind of slow. So late one night, he was observed pouring oil on the road which the trooper investigating that accident, which happened about 15 minutes later, said, "There's oil on the road." And they put an end to his ability to draw insurance from the wrecked cars that were wrecked further on the curve. There are,
Another story here. You got time for another story?
but that one,
Just pick one.
oh, what the heck. Miss Sarah Bird Posey told me this, and she said, "Jerry, I want you to know," said, "my daddy grew up here, but his daddy lived longer than a lot of the Douglases did. It seemed like some of them died of stroke and at an early age as generations moved on. But Hugh Douglas, who was in the Civil War, the last thing he rode in the Civil War, is how close horseflesh was getting down to the nubbin, was he rode a Mammoth Jack. And for those of you that don't know what this is, a big donkey. You don't make a lot of getaways on big donkeys, but that was the last thing that he had transporting him around during that 1865 era. But he also became a breeder, not of trotting or pacing standardbred horses, became a breeder of thoroughbred horses out here on the river. Raised quite a few. And one of his best customers were Woodson and Howard. They'd come down from Nashville every once in a while or come in from another part of the country, and they would buy some of his best stock. Well, Woodson and Howard were brothers. Not, one of them named Woodson, one of them named Howard. Well, one of them was named Frank James, the other named Jesse James. And they would come in and buy horses from Mr. Douglas. And one particular story that Sarah Bird shared with me was, they said we were at the West Side track in Nashville, where the Parthenon is now. And we had, they were about to match race. Woodson and Hudson were about to match race this big, tall, 16.5 hand gray gelding. And match race then didn't mean you running horse on horse. It means you ran 3 races, horse against horse, for 2 miles apiece. So most of them, if he wasn't a tough horse, he didn't make it. He usually just ran out of juice. So they had matched the big gray horse against a real good horse. And Mr. Hugh Douglas said, "I'm here racing Beatitude, the little black mare, and I'm not going to race that distance. May race one time, but it was the best 2 out of 3. Can you think this gray horse can do the distance?" And Woodson Frank looked at him, and looked over at Jesse, and Jesse said, "Well, he did all right coming in from Muscle Shoals 2 weeks ago." Whoa. Well, Muscle Shoals was under what was to be the Army Corps of Engineers direction. At that time, they were building a dike and channeling out Blue Water Creek down there near Florence. And the head of the project was a guy named Alexander Smith, who was also the payroll master, and they paid every Friday. And they had noticed these 3 guys that were hanging around that were well dressed and well mounted. One of them was riding a sorrel stocking leg, one of them riding a ball-faced bay, the other one riding a big old tall gray horse. And they were hanging around down there at Muscle Shoals in Florence, and one of them said he was a stock buyer, and the other 2 said they were there, looking for contract work. Well, Alex Smith was at Florence Bank and got the payroll, $5,290.18, some of it in gold. And he mounts his horse, and he's got it in his saddlebags, and he riding down the road, he runs into these 3 guys, well-mounted, well-dressed guys, and they said, "Do you know the way to so-and-so creek?" And he said, yeah, he's holding. So they ride on, and next time he rounds a curve, and they're there waiting on him in the curve, and this time they've got their pistols out of the holster, and they're aimed at him, and he's, "Okay, what's the deal?" They said, "Give us your money." And so he took the payroll, the $5,209.18, I don't know how I can remember that, off of the saddle pommel, and handed it to him, and handed his billfold out to him. And he had like 40 or 50 bucks in the billfold. I don't know exactly how much he had because he'd been running around a little bit. And they said, "Is this your money or the government's money?" He said, "That's my money." They said, "Well, you can have it back. We just want government money." So they made him ride in front of them for 20 some odd miles. They used a compass, and they crossed the state line along about Lawrence County line along toward Loretta area down in there, and let him go. And he rode back because he had a very good description of what the horses was. It's kind of like a car. Well, he's driving Chevrolet, one of them driving, and all this bay with a ball face, the sorrel with stocking legs and a star, and a big old gray horse. And then they tore out and hit the Natchez Trace, went back. They were living in Nashville at the time. Both of Jesse's children were born in Nashville at different times, his daughter and his son. So they were very familiar with Nashville and very familiar with using aliases. But one of the guys he had with him, Bill Ryan, who, you know, pretty easy to identify him. He's riding that big ball-faced horse, but he had the same thing David Hunter's got. So the guy was hair-lipped and he was riding a big ball-faced bay. So next thing you know, there's a guy riding a big ball-faced bay who's hair-lipped, who's got drunk at a tavern on the Kentucky line, and he's got gold money on it. Guess who? They arrest him. And he hits a paper, and Jesse and Frank are there on Fatherland Street in Nashville. They open up a paper, and they've arrested Bill Ryan. I thought, oh, Lord, he's going to tell on us. So they load all their everything up. The Jersey cow tied behind the wagon, the gray gelding, and the whole 9 yards. And they head out and wind up in St. Joe, Missouri, and that's where Jesse met up with them two little dirty little cowards that shot him in the back of the head. So if Bill hadn't got drunk, not you, Bill. If Bill Ryan hadn't got drunk in the Kentucky line at the Roadhouse, it might have been a different outcome for Jesse James. But Sarah Bird said when her daddy got that story, the fairground was opening up down here for that fall, and the word got out that Cole Younger and Frank James historical Wild West show gonna be there. If you watch the movie True Grit, the new one, yeah, how many of you watched that? Come on. At the end of it, the one-armed Mattie Ross is in Memphis, Tennessee, and she walks up to this little boy and she hands him a show bill, and it's July the 16th, 1903, and it's Cole Younger and Frank James historical Wild West show. And she's there to see Rooster, and Rooster's already died. Of course, Rooster was a fictional character anyway. So she finds that out and goes up and she calls Frank James trash because he wouldn't get up when she got there and talked to him. Cole Younger did get up. But in September of 1903, at the Lincoln County Fair, this was in July, Frank James, Cole Younger's Wild West show, right down here at the Lincoln County Fair. And Bird Douglas says, ain't no way. My daddy knew Frank James. Ain't no way Frank James fell. That's bull. So he rides up in the first car in Lincoln County and drives up, and there's an old man whittling on a bale of straw outside the tent. And he walks up to him, tells him why he's there, to discredit Frank James. And he said, my daddy used to race horses with Frank James. He had a little black mare named Beatitude, and they had a big gray gelding that did all right coming in most of it. He told him the whole story. And the old guy had not said a word. And finally he said, I guess that'd make you Hugh Douglas's boy, wouldn't it? And Mr. Bird said, yes, sir, I guess that'd make you Frank James. So that's my last story, Bill. Thank you.